The Thing is one of my absolute favourite movies of all time. There's not a bad scene in it. And one of the very best scenes, one that doesn't involve gore, special effects or explosions, is the sequence in which the team discover that someone has sabotaged the blood bank. Then they become very paranoid at the realisation that one of their ranks isn't human. I can think of no other scene in movie history that conveys as much claustrophobic paranoia as this. In the precursor scene, which is set in broad daylight, the issue that somebody in the camp might not be human is raised by MacReady, and the doc suggests that conducting a blood serum test is the way to go, so they all agree to that course of action. Then we go to the scene of the team discovering that the blood has been sabotaged, and the very first shot is a sneaky one. A lone, unidentified person's feet casually approach the fridge, which has blood pouring out. The person opens it, and then we hear Doc's voice shout to the others.
Gary! Hey, you guys, come here!
I like the fact that the person is initially unidentified because it reinforces the mystery of who sabotaged the blood. It's noteworthy as well that the blood is still runny and appears to have only been pouring out of the fridge for a few minutes at most. If the sabotage had been done hours ago, then the blood would have finished pouring out by now and would be half dried and sticky on the floor. So it seems that after these four, who were all human, and we find that out later, after they agree to a blood test, whoever else was infected at this point must have heard about the blood test and took quick action with the keys to access the blood bank. However, the fact that Windows had borrowed the keys from Gary the night before and dropped them in a panic, this suggests that the imitation intruder had thought ahead and sabotaged the blood well in advance, while they still had the keys.
You got the keys? Get them from Gary. I want to get some stuff out of here.
Let's go, Bennings. I gotta get some sleep.
If the Thing had kept hold of the keys, then Gary would have noticed that they were missing long before this particular argument. So I suspect the freshness of the pouring blood here is just a timeline plot hole for the sake of it looking a bit more dramatic. Another detail that seems to achieve a similar shock value effect is that there are drops of blood splashed around the inside of the fridge, as if the saboteur had squeezed and torn at the bags in anger, but all they've basically done is disconnect the bags, so the blood shouldn't be splashed all over the place. So it makes it look slightly more gory and like the Thing attacked the bags violently. There's also the issue that to sabotage the blood, the Thing could have just disconnected the fridge from the power source, which wouldn't require access to keys. I don't know how long it would take for the blood to die, but surely that would work. Instead, the Thing has left the power source on, which helps dramatically because it ensures that the fridge is lit from the inside. In fact, blood isn't generally stored in lit conditions like this. The light here is for dramatic emphasis in the film so that we can thoroughly see that the bags are empty and probably for a slighter gore effect. So even in this first shot, things have been carefully thought out by the film crew. But an alternative would have been to not show the fridge being opened here and begin the scene with Doc reporting that the blood had been sabotaged, and then the whole team could see the result together. This would have cast a bit more suspicion on Doc from our point of view, because it would further the possibility that Doc had suggested the blood test and then sabotaged the blood himself after Gary lent him the keys to do the test preparation. But I like the version that's in the film anyway. The first line of the scene is,
Gary! Hey, you guys, come here!
Though Gary is in charge anyway, the line might have been included to subliminally pinpoint Gary as the key suspect from the get-go. First cut shows Gary, followed by the others, entering the room, but Fuchs is already there with the Doc, and we can see in the first shot during a pan-up that Doc is the guy in shot because of his blood reddish brown shirt. So between that cut, the one between the first two shots, a short space of time has elapsed during which Fuchs has joined the Doc. It keeps the ball rolling anyway. So everybody piles quickly into this small cramped room to see the sabotage evidence, which confirms what most of them have been in denial of. At least one person in the camp is an imitation, a horrific shape-shifting killer who has now revealed their presence but not who they are imitating. The enemy has also shown its intelligence and its cunning. It isn't just a beast, it was able to anticipate the blood test and prevent it from happening. Oh, there's also a diagram of human anatomy on the wall as the team enter. This is anatomy that the Thing can thoroughly imitate. The first person to react verbally is Norris, who we will later discover is an imitation, but it's unclear if he is an imitation at this point.
Somebody got to the blood!
What?
Second verbal reaction is Childs with an immediate statement of accusation.
Where's Clark? Right here.
Clark's calm response shows that he already knows that he's under suspicion. He was sort of interrogated by Blair in an earlier scene.
How long were you alone with that dog?
I don't know, an hour and a half maybe.
Something easy to miss here is that Gary reaches tentatively for his gun. So the threat of violence is already rearing its head. Clark has stood at the back of the room, out of focus as a silhouette with a little bit of fill light. Maybe his obscure outline here hints at the suspicion of his identity from the others. And he's visually separated from them all with a table between them. This table will disappear as the interactions of the team progress. The physical setting is great. The low ceilings and small room size mean that everyone has to cramp in together in an enclosed space, uncomfortably close together. And the lighting, which we would expect to be much brighter in a lab, is confined to a couple of lamps. And it dramatically lights the characters, some of them in silhouette, others with their faces half in shade, and some, such as Gary, very well lit as if they are in the spotlight of suspicion. And despite the prior scene announcing the blood test intention being full daylight, we can see through a back window here that we've jumped straight to nighttime. Either the characters took a very long time in getting around to setting up this test, which I doubt, or the filmmakers have taken advantage of a day-night continuity error to make this scene literally darker. MacReady is the one who immediately kicks into investigator mode with key questions.
Wait a minute, was this broken into?
No, the lock is undamaged. Somebody opened it, closed it, and then locked it.
Great. Well, who's got access to it?
A missed opportunity here is that the distorting reflections in the upper fridge could have been used for subliminal effect. If the twisted reflection of Doc or someone else could have been shown at some point in a closer shot of the fridge, it could have added an effective shape-shifting implication. We could assume that the intention is here anyway, but I'm not sure. The fridge certainly shows a twisting face reflection of Doc and notably Norris, who will later transform into a Thing, so who knows, maybe it was intentional. Doc is now standing in a place where his feet would be in the pool of blood, but the emphasis is now on personal emotions, so that's a sort of error that wouldn't register on most viewers. One little clue is the behaviour of Palmer. He doesn't speak in the scene at all, and in a situation of utmost paranoia, he keeps his earphones in. As an imitation, he is staying as out of view as he can, perhaps he's even relaxed about the situation. Further mind games from the saboteur are implied.
Wait a minute, was this broken into?
No, the lock is undamaged. Somebody opened it, closed it, and then locked it.
Great.
But think about the other options. How about if the saboteur had closed the fridge and left it unlocked, suggesting that someone had conveniently forgot to lock it at a much earlier point, and this would cast suspicion on everyone at the same time because everyone would have access. And why even bother closing the fridge door at all? Or why not damage the lock to gain entry? That would have cast wider suspicion too. When Mac asks the essential question of who has access to the key and thus the fridge, we get a very good strafing of the camera so that Doc and Gary, the two emerging suspects, their lines are spoken around a blurred and silhouetted figure of Childs so that we can see their line delivery on either side.
Well, who's got access to it? I guess I'm the only one.
And I got the only key.
Oh, that test have worked, Doc?
Oh, I think so, yes.
Somebody else sure as hell thought so.
Although Childs is human, I think his silhouette might have been included here to hint at the mystery enemy also being in the room. Something I do like is that aside from the shot of everyone entering the room, there are no wide shots showing everybody. The camera is placed in among the group for this whole argument, putting us in their emotional shoes. There's always somebody stood off-screen to the side or even behind us, and we're reminded of this by off-screen dialogue.
Oh, that test have worked, Doc?
Oh, I think so, yes.
Somebody else sure as hell thought so.
Especially Palmer, he avoids being in shot and avoids speaking, so even our suspicions are being misguided at the level of cinematography and editing. If the camera had gone for a wide shot at any point during the intensity of the argument, it would have broken our immersion in the scene. The strafing shot visually separates Doc and Gary from the others as key suspects without the characters having to physically step away from each other. Once under question, the reactions from Doc and Gary convey honesty. They both flat out admit that the circumstances put them under suspicion.
Well, who's got access to it? I guess I'm the only one.
And I got the only key.
Doc looks at Gary, very suspicious, so he must be thinking, hey, I'm human, Gary has got to be an imitation. Gary, on the other hand, is already breathing heavy and turning red. He knows he is now suspect number one, and he's probably scared the lynch mob are going to jump him right now, possibly even kill him. Although MacReady is the main character, his back is to us through the first portion of dialogue. Sure, he's leading the investigation, so to speak, but the emphasis is on the accused and their feelings of terror. The camera does eventually get MacReady's face into shot, and we can see that he is nervous here too, trying to act calm, but he's breathing quite deeply. And he's right in the middle of it all. No matter which way he turns, there's someone behind him. In later scenes, he makes a concentrated effort to keep his back to the wall and everyone else in his line of vision.
Now nobody gets out of my sight.
Even though Gary is officially in charge, MacReady was already acting like the boss in earlier scenes, compiling information and making decisions.
All we can do now is hole up till spring, wait for the rescue team.
No, we don't wait. Somebody in this camp ain't what he appears to be. Right now, that may be one or two of us. By spring, it could be all of us.
And Gary doesn't object to this because he knows he's not personally up to the leadership job. It's just a formality. And that's another layer to this scene. Gary, as number one subject of suspicion, leaves a vacuum of official leadership, but he also has a gun, so things could get ugly if someone tries to take it off him. While Doc, as number one scientist, is also under suspicion, which sort of creates an intellectual vacuum in the academic sense. The less self-assured Fuchs will be left to try and fill that role after this scene. There are lots of group psychology dynamics playing out all at once here, and it takes a really good writer and convincing actors to weave this kind of drama. Another amusing subtlety here is that we have the Doc stood against the fridge with the empty blood bags behind him. Yes, he's a suspect, but Gary has his hand placed on the fridge door throughout this argument, even rubbing the door nervously. I think that's a nice visual suggestion that he might have opened the door and sabotaged the blood. Mac's question prompts the first close-up of the scene.
Well, who else could have used that key?
Nobody. I just give it to Copper whenever he needs it.
Gary's close-ups are tighter than anyone else's, being that he's under the most psychological pressure by what's happening. The open door entrance to the room behind him. This was filmed as a separate cutaway. I think it works well though, because the open door to me suggests his desire to run out of the room, away from what's happening, or maybe it suggests that the enemy can be lurking in nearby rooms. That's a frequent visual element in this film, open doorways and cameras moving through or past open doorways. Mac resists the urge to just outright accuse Gary, and he bounces questions around. But we're left with a stalemate where neither man can be pinned down as the culprit.
Who else could have used that key?
Nobody. I just give it to Copper whenever he needs it.
Could anybody have gotten it from you, Doc?
I don't see how. As soon as I'm finished, I return it right away.
Each of them are understandably trying to blame each other, and I love the Doc's rapid response and darting glance of accusation. Now the first close shot of Windows and Childs. Windows backs away and the camera moves with him, pushing Childs out of the shot so that Windows stands alone. I think that's a good visual way of communicating how they're all feeling, cramped in together, but everyone emotionally backing away into their private space during this scene. These men have lived with and trusted each other for a long time, and now that's all gone. They're now facing an immediate double threat of violence from both the monster invader and each other's lynch mob paranoia. The entire dynamic of their existence here has just changed in the space of less than a couple of minutes. And heavy breathing conveys nervousness with a lot of the actors here. And the stillness of the scene so far I think is very, very good because it allows us to notice the finer details of how the characters are breathing, the anxiety in their voice, the colour changes of their skin and so on. Rapid camera movements and dramatic music, that would be the easy option here to try and create a sense of tension and drama, but it wouldn't work as well because it would mask over those finer human details. And so even the howl of exterior cold winds is not heard in this little bit of sequence, even though it overlays many other scenes in the movie. Sometimes stillness and silence is far more dramatic. Windows stepping away possibly hints at another dynamic here. He was the one who borrowed the keys from Gary and dropped them in a panic. This is how the Thing got access to the blood. Does he remember here that he dropped the keys himself? If he does, then he probably doesn't want to be targeted with suspicion. At the same time, if he does remember, then he knows full well that anyone could have picked up the keys. And maybe this is why he backs away from the entire group and is the first to panic and run away. He's the only one who knows that the keys were left out in the open. It makes sense, doesn't it? As he steps away, the questions about who used the key and when continue.
When was the last time you used it?
A day or so ago, I guess.
I suppose somebody could have lifted it off me.
Oh, come on. That key ring of yours is always hooked to your belt.
Child's response is understandable, but it's obvious that Gary is not the Thing because he's too honest and too nervous. If he was the enemy, then he could just lie that the Doc had borrowed the keys several times in the past day or two to shift the blame away from himself. But when Doc says that he hadn't borrowed them off Gary for the last couple of days, Gary doesn't argue with him.
When was the last time you used it?
A day or so ago, I guess.
I suppose somebody could have lifted it off me.
Oh, come on.
We can tell here that Gary's not the Thing, so we totally feel for his vulnerable position. It's unfortunate for Gary that he can't remember lending the keys to Windows. The stress of recent events has no doubt clouded his memory, but at the same time it shows that he doesn't have the leadership skills. MacReady pays attention and remembers things. He was doing this before the Thing first revealed itself in the dog kennel. So now the shouting and potential for violence erupts, for which the autopsy table has conveniently disappeared, facilitating a low camera angle. Personal rivalry is added to the mix. Clark didn't like what Childs said when they first came into the room.
Where's Clark?
Right here.
Childs tries to physically fight him, which contradicts his own suspicions. Why physically attack or even touch someone if you think they might be the Thing? A funny element here is that as the group nearly erupt into a fist fight, Palmer is fixing his shoe or his sock or something. He's way too casual, and still the earphones are in. Having to break up Childs and Clark has worked everyone up now, so others are starting to shout at each other too. Lots of intense stares, angry eyes, tearful eyes. Even Mac looks over emotional now, scratching his head trying to figure everything out. Fuchs tries to get Doc off the hook.
Oh, now wait a minute, Gary. You've been in here on several occasions.
Doc thought of the test.
So what? Is that supposed to clear him?
Well, why?
Bullshit!
Why would he come in here and take it?
Now is that just a personal loyalty thing because they're both scientists? I mean, he even wanted Blair's help after he'd smashed up the radio room.
We need Blair's help. He's the only one who knows what this organism
He's
is
too far
capable of.
gone, Fuse. But get the rest of his notebooks and start going through them.
Childs, hot-tempered as he is right to object. Doc could have thought up the test and then sabotaged the blood to make himself the least suspected. Max certainly agrees because he will later order that Doc and Clark and Gary be tied up and drugged.
All right, Doc. Gary and Clark, move over there away from the others. Norris, you and Childs, shoot him up with morphine. Tie him down in the rec room and watch him. Fuchs, you start working on a new test.
I need Doc's help.
Yeah, you don't want to drug me. Mac, I'm not a prisoner.
So there's even conflict at the level of who should be suspected among those who aren't immediately under suspicion. The situation is turning into a whirlpool headache of complexities, and it doesn't help that the group are now without an official leader. And still Gary has his hand on that fridge door. Now a fumble is heard and the chase for Windows begins. Gary, the one under most suspicion, is the one who notices Windows has gone, even though Gary is not the most observant of the group.
Well, bullshit! Why would he come in here and take it? Windows!
Maybe this was partly a desperate attempt to take attention away from himself. He seems to try and enforce his leadership position by asserting authority over Windows, being that he's the first to catch up with him. And again, we have personal rivalries surfacing here. Gary had already given Windows a little bit of abuse earlier on about his laziness at the radio.
You reach anybody yet?
Reach anybody? We're 1,000 miles from nowhere, man, and it's gonna get a hell of a lot worse before it gets any better.
Well, stick to it, Windows. Stick to it.
That was a pretty aggressive thing to do. But in the interim, the fast-moving Steadicam shot chasing Windows down the hall and him looking back like there's a pursuing monster behind him, this conveys the all-out paranoia now turning to all-out terror. They're all feeling a bit like this. The gun props are interesting here for a couple of reasons. First, why would they be needed on a scientific expedition by non-military personnel? If I'm not mistaken, the two guns on the right look like automatics, military rifles. And why 6 rifles for a team of about a dozen men? There's no animals to shoot down here in the Antarctic. But I do like that the filmmakers avoided the option of turning the rest of the movie into a gunfight, and they didn't bother having characters give each other long speeches spoken from behind pointed guns. Guns tend to be symbols of power, so this would have ruined the sense of vulnerability of the characters. They did have more emphasis on guns in the 2011 prequel, and the film suffered for it. It seems that most thrillers and action movies and so on, they jump far too often toward the formula option of bringing guns into the conflict, and this is true of horror these days as well. Guns were used in the kennel fight and they were proven to be far less effective than flamethrowers. Plus the Norwegian rifle guy didn't make very good use of his gun either, so it makes sense that these guns aren't used any further in the film. But surely the paranoia would make some of these men want to have a rifle, if only to be able to commit suicide rather than be assimilated in that final moment. The guns are left out of the rest of the story, and I assume that Mac had ordered the rifles to be locked firmly away to avoid a bloodbath. It is weird, by the way, that there are at least 4 flamethrower backpacks in this camp. Why flamethrowers? But I don't know enough about Antarctic research outposts to argue otherwise. Windows' paranoia is ramped up by the sounds of incoming footsteps. And now he announces the obvious that everyone has been intensely feeling but no one has actually said yet.
You guys gonna listen to Gary? You gonna let him give the orders? I mean, he could be one of those things!
Being unarmed and seeing that someone is about to die, Mac uses the calm approach, and he is stood apart from everyone, a distant observer and leader in waiting.
Wait a minute. Just take it easy. Put the gun down. Put it down. Gary, you don't want to hurt anybody. Right.
On the floor.
The slow put down of the gun by Windows can be thought of as a waste of screen time, but emotions were riding high, and it does take a minute or two for a strong emotion to fade, so I think this works. If he'd put the gun down too rapidly, it would be a less convincing response. Gary now points his gun at the others to back them off, while he asserts his own innocence, and then he relinquishes his authority.
I don't know about copper, but I give you my word I did not go near that blood. And I guess you'll all feel a little easier if somebody else was in charge.
We can hear the cold winds in this hallway scene, by the way, but the silence that was present in the lab isn't needed now because this is the emotional come down. Windows still has those earplugs in, stood way back out of sight in a shot that possibly has Fuchs surrounded by 2 imitation intruders. If Norris is a thing here, then Gary almost putting him in charge wasn't a great idea. But Norris doesn't want to be a leader anyway.
Norris, I can't see anybody objecting to you.
I'm sorry, fellas, but I'm not up to it.
Is that because he's a thing and doesn't want to be centre of attention and thus more suspected, or is it because he really can't deal with the pressure? We never really get to find out. Mac doesn't jump to be the official leader either, until he sees that if he doesn't, Childs will take over and cause murder, no doubt.
I'll take it.
Hell you will. You should be somebody a little more even-tempered, Childs.
Mac is a leader here by necessity and by superior mental ability, not by conscious choice. No one objects to his leadership because he was already unofficially the natural leader anyway. And after all, he did just defuse a potential murder, which imbues him with that all-important leadership quality. People trust him, and this is a situation where people don't trust each other. He only has to glance at Clark's knife and then in Clark's eyes to convince him to give up his weapon. Childs, on the other hand, sarcastically laughs at MacReady taking charge, foreshadowing the conflict that will occur later when he has Mac locked out of the compound to freeze to death. Did he do that just out of a sense of paranoia, or was it out of personal rivalry too because he wanted to be leader? As for the monstrous enemy, it really ramped up the paranoia in this scene, demolishing the trust between the men and almost causing a death or two, but it made a massive tactical error. By framing Gary to be the primary suspect, it eliminated his official leadership. This in turn created a leadership vacuum, and it forced MacReady to take that role, the only man in the compound with the intelligence, cunning and self-control to take on the Thing. It was a major tactical error. The finishing shot here cuts to anxious Windows backed up in a corner like a scared rabbit with his hands held up. This is how everybody feels. He's still got his hands up even though Gary put the gun down ages ago. He slowly lowers his hands here as if drawing an emotional set of closing curtains to end the scene. It's pretty good. All emotions gradually calm down. And finally cut to the compound from a distance, vulnerable in the vast blackness and hostility of the Antarctic night. Everybody's in the dark now, and none of them are ever going to see daylight again. Seeing the Thing for the first time, this scene was maximum suspense. This was the oh shit scene, where the terror and the isolation kick in, combined weirdly with claustrophobia and isolation at the same time. Very unusual. Each man is locked into a trap with a monster or possibly several of them. Anyone can suddenly turn and attack at any point, and we are made to process these terrifying revelations as the characters do it. We're put in the middle of the events from the cinematography point of view. I've shown the movie to other first-time viewers, and this scene always seems to get at people just as powerfully as the actual monster transformations. The paranoia of this scene gets to people so much that I've often seen them start physically shifting about during that first viewing of the scene, and giving nervous laughs at what's going on between the characters, but never in a manner that is intended to mock the film. Cinematography by Dean Cundy and editing by Todd Ramsey are both outstanding in this sequence. Ramsey had only 2 previous feature films to his name as an editor, the superb Star Trek The Motion Picture and Escape from New York, and yet he edits the Thing with a level of precision and perfectionism normally only seen from seasoned pros who've been in the game for years. Of course he's helped by the marvellous raw footage that was handed to him by the rest of the crew. It must have been a real pleasure to edit this scene. All the acting is excellent, everyone looks scared without overdoing it, they're all natural and convincing. But for me, the winning performance of this scene is Donald Moffat as Gary. He looks petrified, like he's about to faint or vomit, and yet he doesn't act it in any kind of exaggerated way. Donald Moffat passed away last year in 2018, so I'd like to dedicate this video to him. Thanks for watching, folks. More videos and articles at collativelearning.com. Bye bye.